Hello and welcome to the first episode of the restoration of my Aston Martin DBS. But this isn't where the story begins. It actually all started around 5 months ago, so let me take you back. It was a night like many before, browsing the small ads on Facebook, Car and Classic and eBay, hopelessly looking for an Aston Martin that I could somehow afford. But as usual, this was seeming like an impossible task. Being met with numbers like 100,000 or 80,000 for a shell, 120,000 for a drivable project. It felt like it was getting harder and harder to possibly find something that I could ever afford, let alone at 24. But then I found this. It certainly wasn't pretty. In fact, it was outright ugly. You could see from a mile away that it had quite a lot of filler in it, and it hadn't seen the light of day for a very long time. And also, whoever was taking the pictures clearly wasn't qualified. But it was still an Aston Martin. Well, actually he thought it was an Aston Martin. So, I messaged the seller about 5 times, desperately trying to get this car, because it had been up for sale on Facebook for under an hour and it already had 122 people favourite the advert. He replies simply with just his phone number, so I call him. He was a fast talker, so I couldn't understand everything he was saying, but from what I could understand, he sold motorhomes, and he would drive around the country selling motorhomes, finding motorhomes, and he saw this on his travels in a garage. Him and his father bought it, it sat in a garage for a little bit, and now they're selling it. I managed to haggle the price down a little bit, so it was no longer just a good price, it was a stupid good price. As long as the car existed, I was in it for a good amount of money. The amount of money I paid for the car is usually what would get you a cut-up shell for one of these, so I was very pleased. Then the slightly scary part is always sending some money over to secure it. I did all my kind of normal checks that I do, and I sent him over a sum of money, and the plan was to pay the rest upon meeting him the following Friday. But this is where things get a bit strange. So, he tells me the car is at his dad's house, which is up north, in the north of England, so I plan to go that Friday, a few hours trip up with the trailer to pick it up. But then, next thing he says a few days later, the car is now in Norfolk, which is a long way from where he said the car was. So it was already a bit strange. Why had the car moved a few hundred miles closer? But I didn't mind, it worked for me. The car was even closer than I expected it to be, so it was less travel. He told me the car was at his friend's workshop, so that's where I expected to meet him. But he gave me a really bizarre, loose address. So I turn up and I call him, and he guides me to an auction lot. So things are getting stranger and stranger, and I eventually meet him and I talk to him, and he says this is the situation, which is never a good start to turning up to buy a car. The situation was he had lied, basically. He had put the car in for auction and had then put it up for sale privately later on, and I turned up and wanted to buy it. So he wanted to pull the car out of the auction. He was scared that if he pulled the car out of the auction, he could be fined or damage his relationship with the auction house, which makes sense, but it's a conversation that could be had. He owned the car, so I assumed. But at this point, as you can imagine, I was getting quite suspicious whether he did own the car. I turned up and he wanted me to help him remove the car from an auction house. So I was thinking, am I about to become an accomplice to stealing an Aston Martin? But he had already decided what was going to happen. I was going to pretend to be his friend, a mechanic friend, who had, miraculously, an original V8 engine for the car, because it doesn't have its original engine, it doesn't have the right engine, which we'll talk about later. So I was going to go into the auction house with him, which he had pre-arranged, and say, I'll take the car to my workshop, I'll put the original engine in, it'll be back in 10 days. So, first of all, I don't know how they bought that, because it's going to take more than 10 days to put an original engine in one of these Astons. It's quite a big ordeal with all the ancillaries and other bits. But they believed him. But before I did all of this, obviously I said to him, look, I need some proof that you actually own this car. So he went and got the paperwork from the office, and it did have his name on it, and it proved that he'd owned it for a while, and bills and all that sort of thing. So I knew this was more of just a shenanigan as opposed to a proper, you know, legal issue. But we get the car out and everything's fine. And he leaves with his money, I have the car, I'm waiting to load it up. I go back to the auction house because I was still there in the lot, and I said, look, this is actually what's happened. I don't want anything to do with this, you need to know this is what's happened. And they were really pleased that I told them and didn't ultimately care. They just didn't want anything to do with this bloke because he apparently does this sort of thing all the time. So we had a good chat and cleared everything up, and I was left with the car. So it was it was the strangest buying experience I think I've ever had, especially the uncertainty knowing whether I was even dealing with the person who owned the car, and literally having to whip out my acting skills to pretend to be a mechanic and then have to go back and say, actually, I was just talking rubbish. It was strange, but it was all one of these heat of the moment situations, and when you want something really bad, you kind of just do it, and that's what happened. But it ended up being all good on all fronts. He got his money, the auction house knew what was happening, and I got my car. So we got there in the end, but definitely not something I want to do again. Got the car back. As you can see from the pictures, it looked sad. It had been covered in filler, which I already knew, and I didn't mind. I knew it wasn't filler hiding rust, it was filler hiding something else, like aluminium damage. But it had been modified in such a way to try and look like a later V8 car. They hadn't changed the front end, the headlights, but they chopped the lower part, terribly fiberglassed on the big valance, and put a later bonnet on it, which didn't fit, and it all looked ridiculous. So I decided to remove it. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with the car at this stage, whether I was going to keep it, sell it. It was all just a bit up in the air because it was still a big financial commitment and I wasn't sure if I could afford it or anything. But I kind of went heavy-handed into it, and I took the bumper off and took everything else off with it because it was so badly connected. So I was already kind of in deep with the car, just ripping the front end off. But things were only about to get deeper. So I'd heard the engine run at the auction house, and it certainly was rough. One thing to note at this stage is it doesn't have the original engine. It actually is fitted with a Chrysler Mopar 360. This might seem a bit bizarre, but it was actually quite a common thing to do back in the day when these weren't worth very much money. This sort of thing was a lot more common in the 6-cylinder cars, as it shared the engine with the DB5, DB6. So when those more valuable cars needed repairing, it was quite common for the engines to be removed from the DBSs and put in those DB5s and 6s. But obviously this wasn't the same principle with the DBSV8, as it was a totally different and unique engine. However, they were notoriously known for being expensive to repair, so I think when the cars became very cheap, a lot of people swapped them with more economical engines. At the moment, I have no idea where the original engine is. I haven't done too much research. For reference, an original engine is around 20,000 plus pounds, that is. So it's a lot of money, and that just gets you typically an old engine which hasn't been rebuilt, and you then need to rebuild it because it's been sitting for a long time. That doesn't include the cost of getting it in, all the ancillaries needed. If you see the engine bays of these, there's a lot more than just the engine going on. It's quite a system. So realistically, putting in an original engine would be more like 40,000, I think, roughly. And then it's still not going to have the matching number. So for me at least, there's no point of putting an original engine in the car unless it's the original engine, which maybe I'll be able to find somewhere down the line, but right now I'm not too concerned. So as I mentioned, I heard the engine run at the auction house and it sounded rough. So I decided to call my trusted mechanic friends to come and look at the engine, see what could be done if it was just something simple while it was running rough, or maybe something more complex. I'm not a huge engine man myself. I leave that kind of thing to professionals. I'm much more into bodywork, metalwork, all that sort of thing, fabrication, and that's what I do. And engine-wise, I kind of leave it to others to do what they do best. I can do a lot of the basic stuff. When you're around old cars for long enough, of course, this sort of thing happens. But when it comes to analysing an engine like that, which had been heavily modified and sat for a long time, it's something I didn't want to mess around with and just make worse. So yes, the engine is modified. We'll go more into that later. It's been heavily modified to be a lot more powerful than a standard 360. And someone had spent a huge amount of money on it at some point, and that's really interesting. They obviously had desires for it to be a fast car again, but that's something we'll investigate soon. But as I mentioned, things were about to get a lot deeper. It was kind of established that the engine needed to come out to be looked at properly, dismantled. Something was just not right, and it couldn't be analysed on a driveway. So the decision was made very quickly to pull the engine out, which certainly was a decision that I didn't regret as such, but I found it quite a jarring decision, because it really meant I was in this car now. It was no longer saleable quickly. It was no longer this crazy decision which I could get out of rapidly if I needed to. The engine was out and the car was a rolling shell. So that was quite scary, but right now, future Charlie can tell you it was definitely for the best. So the engine was out and it was sent to the machining shop to be inspected, to be measured, and to make an assessment of what we need to do to make it right. So this left me with a lot of time looking at the Aston shell. And I was okay doing that for a little bit, but as the days went on, I became more and more impatient. I wanted to start doing something with it, and I was still a bit all over the place with what my plans were with the car. But I decided to start sanding. Little did I know at this stage, this would be the start of the most unpleasant 2 months of my life when it comes to cars. Filler is always something that's disgusting to remove, and it goes everywhere, and we all know what it's like, it's not fun. But this was the most filler I have ever seen on a car by such a vast margin. I'm talking inches. The amount of weight reduction that removing this filler has achieved is vast. I don't even know how to describe it. It must have been litres and litres of filler over the whole car. And for the most part, it wasn't about hiding anything. It was creating, I suppose, a more 80s look. The whole car looked a bit more rounded, and obviously it was to blend a lot of the modifications in, and of course to hide some damage. But I think it was all done at the same time to hide various bits of damage and also give it this slightly more modern look. But yeah, whoever actually did it, I think, was a bit of a filler artist, because it was brilliantly done, even though it was completely idiotic and disgusting. But they'd done it with such a huge amount of skill and precision. And I've no idea how they managed to get that much filler to stick to the car for so long. And yeah, it was just quite remarkable. But it genuinely did take about 2.5 months to get all the filler off the car. Of course, this was because I was doing it in and around other commitments, but also there was only so much I could really do every day. It was such a horrible job, and I attacked it with a few different methods. Initially, I tried paint stripper, try and soften it, and that just wasn't going anywhere. I then tried using a paint removal disc, which ultimately became my chosen method. The paint removal disc was something I still had to be a bit careful with, because even though it doesn't remove much metal, it still can warp metal a little bit, and especially when heat's involved and you're close to sharp edges. So I had to be very careful, and it just created such a mess. It was awful. It was just like a dust storm everywhere I was. And every single day I was coming in, my hair was white, my skin was just covered in dust everywhere. My clothes were just completely caked in dust. It was disgraceful. But after about 2.5 months, I got there, which takes us to round about now. Other things that I have achieved in this time frame whilst I was doing the filler, because I had to keep taking breaks and just doing other bits of the car so I didn't feel absolutely miserable. I got the correct bonnet and started stripping that, which was quite a task in itself. Again, lots of horrible layers of paint and bizarre repairs. I got it very cheap off Facebook, so I was really pleased. I am going to get a better one. I found a better bonnet, which is still not very expensive, so I'm just going to replace it, because as you can see, it's had some dodgy repairs, it's a bit warped, it's easier for me just to get a replacement than it is for me to mess around trying to make this one sit right. But either way, it was still a nice thing to have and see the car look a bit closer to what it should look like. I also have started stripping the engine bay of all the ancillary parts and bagging those up and organising it, as I will be painting the engine bay and everything like that. I'm certainly at a point with the car where I'm going a lot deeper than I expected. I'm doing everything properly and going for certainly some form of kind of light restoration. I don't have the budget, time, or really I don't feel it's necessary to take all the body off the car, sandblast the chassis, all that sort of thing. It's actually a very solid car, which is quite remarkable. I think it has just lived its life inside. There are certainly a couple of welds on the sills, but they're okay, and I've seen far worse. And when I see a lot of these Aston Martin projects, they're so rusty. There's so little left of them. I'll insert some pictures of another one that I saw, and there's just nothing left of the underside. So I really have got lucky on the frame side of things. It's really solid, just with kind of light maintenance welds. Another thing I did before I started stripping the car of all the filler was I removed the interior, the carpet, just for good measure, otherwise it would have been a nightmare to start cleaning things up. I also removed a lot of the electrics. It had a lot of bizarre 80s alarm immobilizer systems, so that all came out, and I'll insert a picture of all the wiring that was removed. So again, it must have lost a huge amount of weight in dodgy electricals I pulled out. So I'm in the process now of bringing the wiring loom back to original. It's more or less there, back to exactly how it was from the factory, and that is much better. With the interior pulled, you can see the condition of the inside. It really is very good. Again, these cars are so low. Many of them I've seen have significant damage to the floor pans, especially in the boot area, I've noticed. But this really doesn't. As you can see, it's got a slight ripple on the passenger side floor. But with some heat and some work, I'll easily be able to sort that out. It hasn't split the metal or anything like that. And I'll show you some of the parts which I've taken off. The interior is actually in really good condition, especially the dashboard area. It's brilliant. The seats are a bit tired, as you can expect, and there's a really annoying paint mark on the driver's seat, which I'm going to try and get off. I have done some experimenting with white spirit, which is always a bit scary, putting white spirit near leather, but perhaps someone could advise the best way I can get this off. It looks like red oxide of some sort. I'm not sure how old it is, so if it's the proper old red oxide or the more modern stuff. So I suppose it depends which variant it is to dictate how the best way of removing it is. But on the whole, the interior is really good, and it's got a nice patina to it. There's no major rips, and it's really comfortable. So I'm not sure my plans for that, but for now I'm happy with it, and I've given it some leather feed, and it's just sitting here in the barn until its time is up for a decision to be made, whether it just goes back in or whether it's being reupholstered, all that sort of thing. But I'm of the mindset, keep things original if you can. I don't think there's any point, especially with one like this, doing such a concourse restoration so there's no car left. You know, that defeats the point. You might as well just build one from scratch. So that is the car. I think in the next episode we'll talk parts, talk plans, all of this sort of thing. I think I just wanted to make an episode to introduce myself and the car and talk a little bit about the project, what's happened thus far. Like I mentioned, we're right at the beginning of this, so there's a huge way to go, but it's really exciting, and I'm just really grateful to be able to have this project in my life. It's something I've dreamt of since I was really young, so it's going to be fantastic. I've got a lot of parts on order, and I'm going in a few days to collect even more parts, so in the next couple of weeks there'll be a new video where I'll unveil all of the parts, and trust me, there is a lot, and we'll go over build plans. This is something I'd like to have done in the next 12 months, so I'm certainly giving myself a schedule, otherwise these things just drift. And as I mentioned, we're not going for a historically perfect restoration. The car right now just doesn't have the credentials to be that car. Obviously, it doesn't have the right engine in it, for one. If anybody has some advice on finding the original engine, then I'd definitely be interested. But for now, I'm definitely sticking with the Mopar engine, sorry. And I'm actually really excited to see what we can do with that engine. I'll talk more about what's been going on with it in the next episode, because that's been away for the last few months at the engine shop, and we're having fun with that. So things are shaping up, and I'm excited. I think the overall theme of the build is, condition-wise, I want it to be exquisite. There's no doubt about that. This isn't somehow cutting corners and messing around. The car is going to be completely perfect metal-wise. I'll be able to get the body absolutely perfect, the front end completely repaired, and there'll be no filler on the car. That is ultimately my biggest wish. I hate filler, and this car will never see filler again, which is an achievement in itself. So that would be really exciting, and that's where a huge amount of the work will be, is panel beating and welding new sections on and all that sort of things. I have a few colours in mind already, but that's just me projecting, getting excited. We don't have to think about it for a long time. We've got too much in front of us first. But let me know what you want to see. Any other parts of the car you want me to explore. I know so much about this car. Over the last few months, I've learned so much about its history and its life. And if there's anything you'd like me to do with the car, any ideas, any suggestions for the build, I will be embarking this mostly on my own. I'm going to do all the metal work myself. It's something I really enjoy doing. The engine is being rebuilt elsewhere, and I'll have lots of photos of that. I'll be painting it myself. That's my favourite thing to do. And yeah, it's going to be very much a solo project, which is going to make it a very personal car to me. I'm excited to learn new things. I'm excited to to one day enjoy this car. So come along for the ride. Please like, subscribe, comment, let me know what you think. This is my first ever time doing a video like this, so apologies if I'm a bit rusty and my equipment isn't brilliant. I promise things will get better as they go along, and any suggestions would be great. So thank you so much for watching, and tune in next time. Bye bye.